there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
There are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda, and whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence.
We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms, because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
That has to stop, says Kamala Harris. What has to stop? What has to stop is speech that she and so many people don't agree with. That's what has to stop in her mind and in the mind, the collective mind of the left. You know, I'm doing this show today because we have the election coming up in a couple of days. And let me say up front here, I don't have any illusion that I'm going to change anybody's mind about who they're going to vote for. But I do want you to know what's at stake. And what we're talking about today, I've talked about it before, is the First Amendment, the freedom of speech and assembly. The First Amendment, it's number one for a reason. But what I really want to focus on today and before the election is that this battle to maintain the right to free speech, yes, hate speech, quote unquote misinformation, however you want to label it, unsavory speech, things with which you disagree, things with which piss you off, things with which you are offended by, or by which you are offended. That's what the First Amendment is there for. That's what the First Amendment was designed to protect. Speech with which you disagree. It's not to protect speech that everybody's happy with, that everybody supports, that everybody's in lockstep with. You wouldn't need a protection for that. That's like having protection to breathe. Everybody is happy to breathe. You don't need protection for that. You need protection for dissenters. It's the lifeblood of our Constitution, of our republic. That's why it's there. But I want to make something clear that this battle is not new. The assault on the First Amendment of the freedom to speak freely, free speech, has been going on almost since the creation of this nation. It's a fight that will unfortunately never end, and we have to defend it. So with that, let me give you a little perspective. Frederick Douglass, I know that almost everybody in this audience knows who Frederick Douglass is, but for the sake of just filling in those possible gaps here and there, Frederick Douglass, of course, was a man who was born into slavery. Born to slavery in the early 19th century, went on to become one of the greatest orators of all time and an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, a supporter, a huge supporter, obviously. As a matter of fact, a pillar of the Republican Party that was founded to end slavery. That was the platform. That was the platform on which Abraham Lincoln was voted into office, 1860. So right after Abraham Lincoln was elected to office, just afterwards, in December of 1860, Frederick Douglass and a group of other abolitionists, they met at a church in Boston. It was the Tremont Temple Baptist Church in Boston for a discussion about how can slavery be abolished? And what happened there? That meeting was disrupted and shut down by people who were opposed to what Frederick Douglass and others were saying. They crushed the right of free speech. They either didn't like what he was saying, or they didn't like who was saying it. So we have the same issues going on right now about other topics. Slavery is not the topic that we're dealing with today, but you can come up with any number of issues that are facing this country about which people disagree. And some people do not want the arguments of the other side to be published, to be heard, to be spread, to be available. And that video that we played at the opening of this show is specific and clear. When Tim Walz says, well, there's no right to First Amendment right to hate speech, he's either lying or he's ignorant or both. And when Kamala Harris talks about we need to hold people accountable for misinformation, this is an ignorant person. And I'm talking specifically in regards to the United States Constitution, the First Amendment. This person wants to be the commander in chief. This person wants to take an oath on the Bible saying that she will defend the Constitution, yet she says that some information, some speech is not acceptable. And people who engage in certain speech should be held accountable, either civilly or criminally. Those are her words. Go back and watch the tape again. So with that said, that perspective, I want to read to you right now a speech that Frederick Douglass gave right after this meeting that was shut down by a mob in Boston in 1860. And I want you to hear this man's passion and clarity regarding the First Amendment and our founding fathers. I want you to take the time to listen to this speech by Frederick Douglass from 164 years ago. That's just as applicable today.
A plea for free speech. Boston is a great city, and Music Hall has a fame almost as extensive as Boston. Nowhere more than here have the principles of human freedom been expounded. But for the circumstances already mentioned, it would seem almost presumptuous for me to say anything here about those principles. And yet, even here in Boston, the moral atmosphere is dark and heavy. The principles of human liberty, even if correctly apprehended, find but limited support in this hour of trial. The world moves slowly, and Boston is much like the world. We thought the principle of free speech was an accomplished fact. Here, if nowhere else, we thought, the right of the people to assemble and to express their opinion was secure. Dr. Channing had defended the right. Mr. Garrison had practically asserted the right, and Theodore Parker had maintained it with steadiness and fidelity to the last. But here we are today, contending for what we thought was gained years ago. The mortifying and disgraceful fact stares us in the face that though Faneuil Hall and Bunker Hill monuments stand, freedom of speech is struck down. No lengthy detail of facts is needed. They are already notorious, far more so than will be wished 10 years hence. The world knows that last Monday, a meeting assembled to discuss the question, how shall slavery be abolished? The world also knows that that meeting was invaded, insulted, captured by a mob of gentlemen, and thereafter broken up and dispersed by the order of the mayor, who refused to protect it though called upon to do so. If this had been a mere outbreak of passion and prejudice among the baser sort, maddened by rum and hounded on by some wily politician to serve some immediate purpose, a mere exceptional affair, it might be allowed to rest with what has already been said. But the leaders of the mob were gentlemen. They were men who pride themselves upon their respect for law and order. These gentlemen brought their respect for the law with them and proclaimed it loudly while in the very act of breaking the law. Theirs was the law of slavery. The law of free speech and the law for the protection of public meetings they trampled underfoot, while they greatly magnified the law of slavery. The scene was an instructive one. Men seldom see such a blending of the gentleman with the rowdy as was shown on that occasion. It proved that human nature is very much the same, whether in tarpaulin or broadcloth. Nevertheless, when gentlemen approach us in the character of lawless and abandoned loafers, assuming for the moment their manners and tempers, they have themselves to blame if they are estimated below their quality. No right was deemed by the fathers of the government more sacred than the right of speech. It was, in their eyes, as in the eyes of all thoughtful men, the great moral renovator of society and government. Daniel Webster called it a homebred right, a fireside privilege. Liberty was meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions had ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. Thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers founded in injustice and wrong are sure to tremble if men are allowed to reason of righteousness, temperance, and of a judgment to come in their presence. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South. They will have none of it there, for they have the power. But shall it be so here? Even here in Boston, and among the Friends of Freedom, we hear two voices. One denouncing the mob that broke up our meeting on Monday as a base and cowardly outrage, and another deprecating and regretting the holding of such a meeting by such men at such a time. We are told that the meeting was ill-timed and the parties to it unwise. Why, what is the matter with us? Are we going to palliate and excuse a palpable and flagrant outrage on the right of free speech by implying that only a particular description of persons should exercise that right? Are we, at such a time when a great principle has been struck down, to quench the moral indignation which the deed excites by casting reflections upon those on whose persons the outrage has been committed? After all the arguments for liberty to which Boston has listened for more than a quarter of a century, has she yet to learn that the time to assert a right is the time when the right itself is called in question, and that the men of all others to assert it are the men to whom the right has been denied? It would be no indication of the right of speech to prove that certain gentlemen of great distinction, eminent for their learning and ability, are allowed to freely express their opinions on all subjects, including the subject of slavery. Such a vindication would need itself to be vindicated. It would add insult to injury. Not even an old-fashioned abolition meeting could vindicate that right in Boston just now. There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up, or however humble, however young, or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress their honest sentiments. Equally clear is the right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the right of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear as it would be to rob him of his money. I have no doubt that Boston will vindicate this right. But in order to do so, there must be no concessions to the enemy. When a man is allowed to speak because he is rich and powerful, it aggravates the crime of denying the right to the poor and the humble. The principle must rest upon its own basis. And until the right is accorded to the humblest as freely as to the most exalted citizen, the government of Boston is but an empty name and its freedom a mockery. A man's right to speak does not depend upon where he was born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and there let it rest forever.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're like me, you're going to want to go back and listen to that speech or read it time and time again. Every time I read it, more pops out to me about how important what Frederick Douglass said was then and is today. There are a lot of things that we can disagree on, but one thing that no true American should ever disagree on is the foundational right to free speech, free expression, with those few exceptions that are articulated, that are in violation of law, inciting a riot, making clear threats, criminal threats to someone. These are very, very narrow examples about where free speech actually crosses the line. But again, they are extremely narrow examples. But free speech is a God-given right. The ability to express ideas, to share ideas, and the ability and the right to listen to hear ideas, the way that Frederick Douglass so beautifully made clear. So come election day, and again, is it my job here to convince anybody to vote one way or another? Well, look, of course I hope you vote in a certain way. I'm sure you hope the same for me. But what I am asking of you is to consider what is truly most important. What are some of the things that make the United States of America unique from almost every other society, not just today, but that ever existed? And one of those things is the First Amendment. For Your Leo Nation, I'm the Chief Mark Garrett. God bless you. God bless America.